Chapter 24. Sometimes lolling upon Tantor's back, sometimes roaming the jungle in solitude, Korak made his way slowly toward the west and south. He made but a few miles a day, for he had a whole lifetime before him and no place in particular to go. Possibly he would have moved more rapidly, but for the thought which continually haunted him that each mile he traversed carried him further and further away from Miriam. No longer his Miriam as of yore, it is true, but still as dear to him as ever. Thus he came upon the trail of the sheik's band as it traveled down river from the point where the sheik had captured Miriam to his own stockaded village. Korak pretty well knew who it was that had passed, for there were few in the great jungle with whom he was not familiar, though it had been years since he had come this far north. He had no particular business, however, with the old sheik, and so he did not propose following him. The further from men he could stay, the better pleased he would be. He wished that he might never see a human face again. Men always brought him sorrow and misery. The river suggested fishing, and so he dawdled upon its shores, catching fish after a fashion of his own devising and eating them raw. When night came, he curled up in a great tree beside the stream, the one from which he had been fishing during the afternoon, and was soon asleep. Numa, roaring beneath him, awoke him. He was about to call out in anger to his noisy neighbor when something else caught his attention. He listened. Was there something in the tree beside himself? Yes, he heard the noise of something below him trying to clamber upward. Presently he heard the click of a crocodile's jaws in the waters beneath, and then, low but distinct, "By George, the beggar nearly got me." The voice was familiar. Korak glanced downward toward the speaker. Outlined against the faint luminosity of the water, he saw the figure of a man clinging to a lower branch of the tree. Silently and swiftly the ape-man clambered downward. He felt a hand beneath his foot. He reached down and clutched the figure beneath him and dragged it up among the branches. It struggled weakly and struck at him. But Korak paid no more attention than Tantor to an ant. He lugged his burden to the higher safety and greater comfort of a broad crotch, and there he propped it in a sitting position against the bole of the tree. Numa still was roaring beneath them, doubtless in anger that he had been robbed of his prey. Korak shouted down at him, calling him in the language of the great apes, "Old green-eyed eater of carrion, brother of Dango, the hyena," and other choice appellations of jungle opprobrium. The Honorable Morrison Baines, listening, felt assured that a gorilla had seized upon him. He felt for his revolver, and as he was drawing it stealthily from its holster, a voice asked in perfectly good English, "Who are you?" Baines started so that he nearly fell from the branch. "My God," he exclaimed, "are you a man?" "What did you think I was?" asked Korak. "A gorilla," replied Baines honestly. Korak laughed. "Who are you?" he repeated. "I'm an Englishman by the name of Baines. But who the devil are you?" asked the Honorable Morrison. "They call me the Killer," replied Korak, giving the English translation of the name that Akut had given him. And then, after a pause, during which the Honorable Morrison attempted to pierce the darkness and catch a glimpse of the features of the strange being into whose hands he had fallen, "You are the same whom I saw kissing the girl at the edge of the great plain to the east, that time that the lion charged you?" "Yes," replied Baines. "What are you doing here?" "The girl was stolen. I am trying to rescue her." "Stolen?" The word was shot out like a bullet from a gun. "Who stole her?" "The Swede trader, Hansen," replied Baines. "Where is he?" Baines related to Korak all that had transpired since he had come upon Hansen's camp. Before he was done, the first gray dawn had relieved the darkness. Korak made the Englishman comfortable in the tree. He filled his canteen from the river and fetched him fruits to eat. Then he bid him good-bye. "I am going to the Swede's camp," he announced. "I will bring the girl back to you here." "I shall go too, then," insisted Baines. "It is my right and my duty, for she was to have become my wife." Korak winced. "You are wounded. You could not make the trip," he said. "I can go much faster alone." "Go, then," replied Baines, "but I shall follow. It is my right and duty." "As you will," replied Korak with a shrug. If the man wanted to be killed, it was none of his affair. He wanted to kill him himself, but for Miriam's sake he would not. If she loved him, then he must do what he could to preserve him, but he could not prevent his following him, more than to advise him against it, and this he did earnestly. And so Korak set out rapidly toward the north, and limping slowly and painfully along, soon far to the rear, came the tired and wounded Baines. Korak had reached the river bank opposite Malbine's camp before Baines had covered 2 miles. Late in the afternoon, the Englishman was still plodding wearily along, forced to stop often for rest when he heard the sound of the galloping feet of a horse behind him. Instinctively, he drew into the concealing foliage of the underbrush, and a moment later a white-robed Arab dashed by. Baines did not hail the rider. He had heard of the nature of the Arabs who penetrate thus far to the south, and what he had heard had convinced him that a snake or a panther would as quickly befriend him as one of these villainous renegades from the Northland. When Abdul-Kamak had passed out of sight toward the north, Baines resumed his weary march. A half-hour later, he was again surprised by the unmistakable sound of galloping horses. This time there were many. Once more he sought a hiding place, but it chanced that he was crossing a clearing which offered little opportunity for concealment. He broke into a slow trot, the best that he could do in his weakened condition. But it did not suffice to carry him to safety, and before he reached the opposite side of the clearing, a band of white-robed horsemen dashed into view behind him. At sight of him they shouted in Arabic, which, of course, he could not understand, and then they closed about him, threatening and angry. Their questions were unintelligible to him, and no more could they interpret his English. At last, evidently out of patience, the leader ordered 2 of his men to seize him, which they lost no time in doing. They disarmed him and ordered him to climb to the rump of one of the horses, and then the 2 who had been detailed to guard him turned and rode back toward the south, while the others continued their pursuit of Abdul-Kamak. As Korak came out upon the bank of the river across from which he could see the camp of Malbine, he was at a loss as to how he was to cross. He could see men moving about among the huts inside the boma. Evidently, Hansen was still there. Korak did not know the true identity of Miriam's abductor. How was he to cross? Not even he would dare the perils of the river, almost certain death. For a moment he thought, then wheeled and sped away into the jungle, uttering a peculiar cry, shrill and piercing. Now and again he would halt to listen as though for an answer to his weird call, then on again, deeper and deeper into the wood. At last his listening ears were rewarded by the sound they craved, the trumpeting of a bull elephant, and a few moments later Korak broke through the trees into the presence of Tantor, standing with upraised trunk, waving his great ears. "Quick, Tantor!" shouted the ape-man, and the beast swung him to his head. "Hurry!" And the mighty pachyderm lumbered off through the jungle, guided by kicking of naked heels against the sides of his head. Toward the northwest, Korak guided his huge mount until they came out upon the river a mile or more above the Swedes' camp, at a point where Korak knew that there was an elephant ford. Never pausing, the ape-man urged the beast into the river, and with trunk held high, Tantor forged steadily toward the opposite bank. Once an unwary crocodile attacked him, but the sinuous trunk dove beneath the surface, and grasping the amphibian about the middle, dragged it to light and hurled it 100 feet downstream. And so, in safety, they made the opposite shore, Korak perched high and dry above the turgid flood. Then, back toward the south Tantor moved, steadily, relentlessly, and with a swinging gait which took no heed of any obstacle other than the larger jungle trees. At times, Korak was forced to abandon the broad head and take to the trees above, so close the branches raked the back of the elephant. But at last they came to the edge of the clearing where lay the camp of the renegade Swede, nor even then did they hesitate or halt. The gate lay upon the east side of the camp, facing the river. Tantor and Korak approached from the north. There was no gate there, but what cared Tantor or Korak for gates? At a word from the ape-man, and raising his tender trunk high above the thorns, Tantor breasted the boma, walking through it as though it had not existed. A dozen blacks squatted before their huts looked up at the noise of his approach. With sudden howls of terror and amazement, they leaped to their feet and fled for the open gates. Tantor would have pursued. He hated man, and he thought that Korak had come to hunt these. But the ape-man held him back, guiding him toward a large canvas tent that rose in the center of the clearing. There should be the girl and her abductor. Malbine lay in a hammock beneath canopy before his tent. His wounds were painful, and he had lost much blood. He was very weak. He looked up in surprise as he heard the screams of his men and saw them running toward the gate, and then from around the corner of his tent loomed a huge bulk, and Tantor, the great tusker, towered above him. Malbine's boy, feeling neither affection nor loyalty for his master, broke and ran at the first glimpse of the beast, and Malbine was left alone and helpless. The elephant stopped a couple of paces from the wounded man's hammock. Malbine cowered, moaning. He was too weak to escape. He could only lie there with staring eyes, gazing in horror into the blood-rimmed, angry little orbs fixed upon him, and await his death. Then, to his astonishment, a man slid to the ground from the elephant's back. Almost at once, Malbine recognized the strange figure as that of the creature who consorted with apes and baboons. The white warrior of the jungle who had freed the king baboon and led the whole angry horde of hairy devils upon him and Jensen. Malbine cowered still lower. "Where is the girl?" demanded Korak in English. "What girl?" asked Malbine. "There is no girl here, only the women of my boys. Is it one of them you want?" "The white girl," replied Korak. "Do not lie to me. You lured her from her friends. You have her. Where is she?" "It was not I," cried Malbine. "It was an Englishman who hired me to steal her. He wished to take her to London with him. She was willing to go. His name is Baines. Go to him if you want to know where the girl is." "I have just come from him," said Korak. "He sent me to you. The girl is not with him. Now stop your lying and tell me the truth. Where is she?" Korak took a threatening step toward the Swede. Malbine shrank from the anger in the other's face. "I will tell you," he cried. "Do not harm me, and I will tell you all that I know. I had the girl here, but it was Baines who persuaded her to leave her friends. He had promised to marry her. He does not know who she is, but I do, and I know that there is a great reward for whoever takes her back to her people. It was the only reward I wanted. But she escaped and crossed the river in one of my canoes. I followed her, but the sheik was there, God knows how, and he captured her and attacked me and drove me back. Then came Baines, angry because he had lost the girl, and shot me. If you want her, go to the sheik and ask him for her. She has passed as his daughter since childhood." "She is not the sheik's daughter?" asked Korak. "She is not," replied Malbine. "Who is she then?" asked Korak. Here Malbine saw his chance. Possibly he could make use of his knowledge after all. It might even buy back his life for him. He was not so credulous as to believe that this savage ape-man would have any compunctions about slaying him. "When you find her, I will tell you," he said, "if you will promise to spare my life and divide the reward with me. If you kill me, you will never know, for only the sheik knows, and he will never tell. The girl herself is ignorant of her origin." "If you have told me the truth, I will spare you," said Korak. "I shall go now to the sheik's village, and if the girl is not there, I shall return and slay you. As for the other information you have, if the girl wants it when we have found her, we will find a way to purchase it from you." The look in the killer's eyes and his emphasis of the word purchase were none too reassuring to Malbine. Evidently, unless he found means to escape, this devil would have both his secret and his life before he was done with him. He wished he would be gone and take his evil-eyed companion away with him. The swaying bulk towering high above him and the ugly little eyes of the elephant watching his every move made Malbine nervous. Korak stepped into the Swede's tent to assure himself that Miriam was not hid there. As he disappeared from view, Tantor, his eyes still fixed upon Malbine, took a step nearer the man. An elephant's eyesight is none too good, but the great tusker evidently had harbored suspicions of this yellow-bearded white man from the first. Now he advanced his snake-like trunk toward the Swede, who shrank still deeper into his hammock. The sensitive member felt and smelled back and forth along the body of the terrified Malbine. Tantor uttered a low, rumbling sound. His little eyes blazed. At last he had recognized the creature who had killed his mate long years before. Tantor, the elephant, never forgets and never forgives. Malbine saw in the demoniacal visage above him the murderous purpose of the beast. He shrieked aloud to Korak, "Help! Help! The devil is going to kill me!" Korak ran from the tent just in time to see the enraged elephant's trunk encircle the beast's victim, and then hammock, canopy, and man were swung high over Tantor's head. Korak leaped before the animal, commanding him to put down his prey unharmed. But as well might he have ordered the eternal river to reverse its course. Tantor wheeled around like a cat, hurled Malbine to the earth, and kneeled upon him with the quickness of a cat. Then he gored the prostrate thing through and through with his mighty tusks, trumpeting and roaring in his rage, and at last, convinced that no slightest spark of life remained in the crushed and lacerated flesh, he lifted the shapeless clay that had been Sven Malbine far aloft and hurled the bloody mass, still entangled in canopy and hammock, over the boma and out into the jungle. Korak stood looking sorrowfully on at the tragedy he gladly would have averted. He had no love for the Swede, in fact only hatred, but he would have preserved the man for the sake of the secret he possessed. Now that secret was gone forever unless the sheikh could be made to divulge it, but in that possibility Korak placed little faith. The ape-man, as unafraid of the mighty Tantor as though he had not just witnessed his shocking murder of a human being, signaled the beast to approach and lift him to its head, and Tantor came as he was bid, docile as a kitten, and hoisted the killer tenderly aloft. From the safety of their hiding places in the jungle, Malbine's boys had witnessed the killing of their master, and now, with wide, frightened eyes, they saw the strange white warrior, mounted upon the head of his ferocious charger, disappear into the jungle at the point from which he had emerged upon their terrified vision. Chapter 25. The sheik glowered at the prisoner which his two men brought back to him from the north. He had sent the party after Abdul Kamak, and he was wroth that instead of his erstwhile lieutenant they had sent back a wounded and useless Englishman. Why had they not dispatched him where they had found him? He was some penniless beggar of a trader who had wandered from his own district and became lost. He was worthless. The sheik scowled terribly upon him. "Who are you?" he asked in French. "I am the Honorable Morrison Baines of London," replied his prisoner. The title sounded promising, and at once the wily old robber had visions of ransom. His intentions, if not his attitude toward the prisoner, underwent a change. He would investigate further. "What were you doing poaching in my country?" growled he. "I was not aware that you owned Africa," replied the Honorable Morrison. "I was searching for a young woman who had been abducted from the home of a friend. The abductor wounded me, and I drifted down river in a canoe. I was on my way back to his camp when your men seized me." "A young woman?" asked the sheik. "Is that she?" And he pointed to his left over toward a clump of bushes near the stockade. Baines looked in the direction indicated, and his eyes went wide, for there, sitting cross-legged upon the ground, her back toward them, was Miriam. "Miriam!" he shouted, starting toward her. but one of his guards grasped his arm and jerked him back. The girl leaped to her feet and turned toward him as she heard her name. "Morrison!" she cried. "Be still and stay where you are," snapped the sheik, and then to Baines. "So you are the dog of a Christian who stole my daughter from me?" "Your daughter?" ejaculated Baines. "She is your daughter?" "She is my daughter," growled the Arab, "and she is not for any unbeliever. You have earned death, Englishman, but if you can pay for your life, I will give it to you." Baines's eyes were still wide at the unexpected sight of Miriam here in the camp of the Arab when he had thought her in Hanson's power. What had happened? How had she escaped the Swede? Had the Arab taken her by force from him, or had she escaped and come voluntarily back to the protection of the man who called her daughter? He would have given much for a word with her. If she was safe here, he might only harm her by antagonizing the Arab in an attempt to take her away and return her to her English friends. No longer did the Honorable Morrison harbor thoughts of luring the girl to London. "Well?" asked the sheik. "Oh," exclaimed Baines, "I beg your pardon, I was thinking of something else. Why, yes, of course, glad to pay, I'm sure. How much do you think I'm worth?" The sheik named a sum that was rather less exorbitant than the Honorable Morrison had anticipated. The latter nodded his head in token of his entire willingness to pay. He would have promised a sum far beyond his resources just as readily, for he had no intention of paying anything. His one reason for seeming to comply with the sheik's demands was that the wait for the coming of the ransom money would give him the time and the opportunity to free Miriam if he found that she wished to be freed. The Arab's statement that he was her father naturally raised the question in the Honorable Morrison's mind as to precisely what the girl's attitude toward escape might be. It seemed, of course, preposterous that this fair and beautiful young woman should prefer to remain in the filthy douar of an illiterate old Arab rather than return to the comforts, luxuries, and congenial associations of the hospitable African bungalow from which the Honorable Morrison had tricked her. The man flushed at the thought of his duplicity which these recollections aroused, thoughts which were interrupted by the sheik, who instructed the Honorable Morrison to write a letter to the British consul at Algiers, dictating the exact phraseology of it with a fluency that indicated to his captive that this was not the first time the old rascal had had occasion to negotiate with English relatives for the ransom of a kinsman. Baines demurred when he saw that the letter was addressed to the consul at Algiers, saying that it would require the better part of a year to get the money back to him. But the sheik would not listen to Baines's plan to send a messenger directly to the nearest coast town, and from there communicate with the nearest cable station, sending the Honorable Morrison's request for funds straight to his own solicitors. No. The sheik was cautious and wary. He knew his own plan had worked well in the past. In the other were too many untried elements. He was in no hurry for the money. He could wait a year, or 2 years if necessary, but it should not require over 6 months. He turned to one of the Arabs who had been standing behind him and gave the fellow instructions in relation to the prisoner. Baines could not understand the words, spoken in Arabic, but the jerk of the thumb toward him showed that he was the subject of conversation. The Arab, addressed by the sheik, bowed to his master and beckoned Baines to follow him. The Englishman looked toward the sheik for confirmation. The latter nodded impatiently, and the Honorable Morrison rose and followed his guide toward a native hut which lay close beside one of the outside goatskin tents. In the dark, stifling interior, his guard led him, then stepped to the doorway and called to a couple of black boys squatting before their own huts. They came promptly and, in accordance with the Arab's instructions, bound Baines's wrists and ankles securely. The Englishman objected strenuously, but as neither the blacks nor the Arab could understand a word, he said his pleas were wasted. Having bound him, they left the hut. The Honorable Morrison lay for a long time contemplating the frightful future which awaited him during the long months which must intervene before his friends learned of his predicament and could get succor to him. Now he hoped that they would send the ransom. He would gladly pay all that he was worth to be out of this hole. At first it had been his intention to cable his solicitors to send no money but to communicate with the British West African authorities and have an expedition sent to his aid. His patrician nose wrinkled in disgust as his nostrils were assailed by the awful stench of the hut. The nasty grasses upon which he lay exuded the effluvium of sweaty bodies, of decayed animal matter, and of offal. But worse was yet to come. He had lain in the uncomfortable position in which they had thrown him, but for a few minutes, when he became distinctly conscious of an acute itching sensation upon his hands, his neck, and scalp. He wriggled to a sitting posture, horrified and disgusted. The itching rapidly extended to other parts of his body. It was torture, and his hands were bound securely at his back. He tugged and pulled at his bonds until he was exhausted, but not entirely without hope, for he was sure that he was working enough slack out of the knot to eventually permit of his withdrawing one of his hands. Night came. They brought him neither food nor drink. He wondered if they expected him to live on nothing for a year. The bites of the vermin grew less annoying, though not less numerous. The Honorable Morrison saw a ray of hope in this indication of future immunity through inoculation. He still worked weakly at his bonds, and then the rats came. If the vermin were disgusting, the rats were terrifying. They scurried over his body, squealing and fighting. Finally, one commenced to chew at one of his ears. With an oath, the Honorable Morrison struggled to a sitting posture. The rats retreated. He worked his legs beneath him and came to his knees, and then, by superhuman effort, rose to his feet. There he stood, reeling drunkenly, dripping with cold sweat. "God," he muttered, "what have I done to deserve?" He paused. What had he done? He thought of the girl in another tent in that accursed village. He was getting his deserts. He set his jaws firmly with the realization. He would never complain again. At that moment, he became aware of voices raised angrily in the goatskin tent close beside the hut in which he lay. One of them was a woman's. Could it be Miriam's? The language was probably Arabic. He could not understand a word of it, but the tones were hers. He tried to think of some way of attracting her attention to his near presence. If she could remove his bonds, they might escape together, if she wished to escape. That thought bothered him. He was not sure of her status in the village. If she were the petted child of the powerful sheik, then she would probably not care to escape. He must know definitely. At the bungalow, he had often heard Miriam sing "God Save the King" as my dear accompanied her on the piano. Raising his voice, he now hummed the tune. Immediately, he heard Miriam's voice from the tent. She spoke rapidly. "Goodbye, Morrison," she cried. "If God is good, I shall be dead before morning, for if I still live, I shall be worse than dead after tonight." Then he heard an angry exclamation in a man's voice, followed by the sounds of a scuffle. Baines went white with horror. He struggled frantically again with his bonds. They were giving. A moment later, one hand was free. It was but the work of an instant, then, to loose the other. Stooping, he untied the rope from his ankles. Then he straightened and started for the hut doorway, bent on reaching Miriam's side. As he stepped out into the night, the figure of a huge black rose and barred his progress. When speed was required of him, Korak depended upon no other muscles than his own, and so it was that the moment Tantor had landed him safely upon the same side of the river as lay the village of the sheik, the ape-man deserted his bulky comrade and took to the trees in a rapid race toward the south and the spot where the Swede had told him Miriam might be. It was dark when he came to the palisade, strengthened considerably since the day that he had rescued Miriam from her pitiful life within its cruel confines. No longer did the giant tree spread its branches above the wooden rampart, but ordinary man-made defenses were scarce considered obstacles by Korak. Loosening the rope at his waist, he tossed the noose over one of the sharpened posts that composed the palisade. A moment later, his eyes were above the level of the obstacle, taking in all within their range beyond. There was no one in sight close by, and Korak drew himself to the top and dropped lightly to the ground within the enclosure. Then he commenced his stealthy search of the village. First, toward the Arab tents he made his way, sniffing and listening. He passed behind them, searching for some sign of Miriam. Not even the wild Arab curs heard his passage, so silently he went, a shadow passing through shadows. The odor of tobacco told him that the Arabs were smoking before their tents. The sound of laughter fell upon his ears, and then, from the opposite side of the village, came the notes of a once familiar tune, God Save the King. Korak halted in perplexity. Who might it be? The tones were those of a man. He recalled the young Englishman he had left on the river trail and who had disappeared before he returned. A moment later there came to him a woman's voice in reply. It was Miriam's, and the killer, quickened into action, slunk rapidly in the direction of these two voices. The evening meal over Miriam had gone to her pallet in the women's quarters of the sheik's tent, a little corner screened off in the rear by a couple of priceless Persian rugs to form a partition. In these quarters she had dwelt with Mabunu alone, for the sheik had no wives, nor were conditions altered now after the years of her absence. She and Mabunu were alone in the women's quarters. Presently the sheik came and parted the rugs. He glared through the dim light of the interior. "Miriam," he called, "come hither." The girl arose and came into the front of the tent. There the light of a fire illuminated the interior. She saw Ali ben Kadin, the sheik's half-brother, squatted upon a rug, smoking. The sheik was standing. The sheikh and Ali ben Kadin had had the same father, but Ali ben Kadin's mother had been a slave, a West Coast negress. Ali ben Kadin was old and hideous and almost black. His nose and part of one cheek were eaten away by disease. He looked up and grinned as Miriam entered. The sheik jerked his thumb toward Ali ben Kadin and addressed Miriam. "I am getting old," he said. "I shall not live much longer. Therefore I have given you to Ali ben Kadin, my brother." That was all. Ali ben Kadin rose and came toward her. Miriam shrank back, horrified. The man seized her wrist. "Come," he commanded, and dragged her from the sheik's tent and to his own. After they had gone, the sheik chuckled. "When I send her north in a few months," he soliloquized, "they will know the reward for slaying the son of the sister of Amor ben Katur." And in Ali ben Kadin's tent, Miriam pleaded and threatened, but all to no avail. The hideous old half-caste spoke soft words at first, but when Miriam loosed upon him the vials of her horror and loathing, he became enraged, and rushing upon her, seized her in his arms. Twice she tore away from him, and in one of the intervals during which she managed to elude him, she heard Baines's voice humming the tune that she knew was meant for her ears. At her reply, Ali ben Kadin rushed upon her once again. This time he dragged her back into the rear apartment of his tent, where three negresses looked up in stolid indifference to the tragedy being enacted before them. As the Honorable Morrison saw his way blocked by the huge frame of the giant black, his disappointment and rage filled him with a bestial fury that transformed him into a savage beast. With an oath he leaped upon the man before him, the momentum of his body hurling the black to the ground. There they fought, the black to draw his knife, the white to choke the life from the black. Baines's fingers shut off the cry for help that the other would have been glad to voice, but presently the Negro succeeded in drawing his weapon, and an instant later Baines felt the sharp steel in his shoulder. Again and again the weapon fell. The white man removed one hand from its choking grip upon the black throat. He felt around upon the ground beside him, searching for some missile, and at last his fingers touched a stone and closed upon it. Raising it above his antagonist's head, the Honorable Morrison drove home a terrific blow. Instantly, the black relaxed, stunned. Twice more Baines struck him. Then he leaped to his feet and ran for the goatskin tent from which he had heard the voice of Miriam in distress. But before him was another. Naked but for his leopard skin and his loincloth, Korak, the killer, slunk into the shadows at the back of Ali Ben Kadin's tent. The half-caste had just dragged Miriam into the rear chamber as Korak's sharp knife slit a 6-foot opening in the tent wall, and Korak, tall and mighty, sprang through upon the astonished visions of the inmates. Miriam saw and recognized him the instant that he entered the apartment. Her heart leaped in pride and joy at the sight of the noble figure for which it had hungered for so long. "Korak!" she cried. "Miriam!" He uttered the single word as he hurled himself upon the astonished Ali Ben Kadin. The 3 negresses leaped from their sleeping mats, screaming. Miriam tried to prevent them from escaping. But before she could succeed, the terrified blacks had darted through the hole in the tent wall made by Korak's knife and were gone screaming through the village. The killer's fingers closed once upon the throat of the hideous Ali. Once his knife plunged into the putrid heart, and Ali Ben Kadin lay dead upon the floor of his tent. Korak turned toward Miriam, and at the same moment a bloody and disheveled apparition leaped into the apartment. "Morrison!" cried the girl. Korak turned and looked at the newcomer. He had been about to take Miriam in his arms, forgetful of all that might have transpired since last he had seen her. Then the coming of the young Englishman recalled the scene he had witnessed in the little clearing, and a wave of misery swept over the ape-man. Already from without came the sounds of the alarm that the 3 negresses had started. Men were running toward the tent of Ali Ben Kadin. There was no time to be lost. "Quick!" cried Korak, turning toward Baines, who had scarce yet realized whether he was facing a friend or foe. "Take her to the palisade, following the rear of the tents. Here is my rope. With it you can scale the wall and make your escape." "But you, Korak?" cried Miriam. "I will remain," replied the ape-man. "I have business with the sheik." Miriam would have demurred, but the killer seized them both by the shoulders and hustled them through the slit wall and out into the shadows beyond. "Now run for it," he admonished, and turned to meet and hold those who were pouring into the tent from the front. The ape-man fought well, fought as he had never fought before, but the odds were too great for victory, though he won that which he most craved. Time for the Englishman to escape with Miriam. Then he was overwhelmed by numbers, and a few minutes later, bound and guarded, he was carried to the sheik's tent. The old man eyed him in silence for a long time. He was trying to fix in his own mind some form of torture that would gratify his rage and hatred toward this creature who twice had been the means of his losing possession of Miriam. The killing of Ali Ben Kadin caused him little anger. Always had he hated the hideous son of his father's hideous slave. The blow that this naked white warrior had once struck him added fuel to his rage. He could think of nothing adequate to the creature's offense. And as he sat there looking upon Korak, the silence was broken by the trumpeting of an elephant in the jungle beyond the palisade. A half-smile touched Korak's lips. He turned his head a trifle in the direction from which the sound had come, and then there broke from his lips a low, weird call. One of the blacks guarding him struck him across the mouth with the haft of his spear, but none there knew the significance of his cry. In the jungle, Tantor cocked his ears as the sound of Korak's voice fell upon them. He approached the palisade, and lifting his trunk above it, sniffed. Then he placed his head against the wooden logs and pushed. But the palisade was strong and only gave a little to the pressure. In the sheik's tent, the sheik rose at last and, pointing toward the bound captive, turned to one of his lieutenants. "Burn him," he commanded. "At once. The stake is set." The guard pushed Korak from the sheik's presence. They dragged him to the open space in the center of the village, where a high stake was set in the ground. It had not been intended for burnings, but offered a convenient place to tie up refractory slaves that they might be beaten, ofttimes until death relieved their agonies. To this stake they bound Korak. Then they brought brush and piled about him, and the sheik came and stood by that he might watch the agonies of his victim. But Korak did not wince even after they had fetched a brand and the flames had shot up among the dry tinder. Once, then, he raised his voice in the low call that he had given in the sheik's tent, and now, from beyond the palisade, came again the trumpeting of an elephant. Old Tantor had been pushing at the palisade in vain. The sound of Korak's voice calling him and the scent of man, his enemy, filled the great beast with rage and resentment against the dumb barrier that held him back. He wheeled and shuffled back a dozen paces, then he turned, lifted his trunk, and gave voice to a mighty roaring trumpet call of anger, lowered his head, and charged like a huge battering ram of flesh and bone and muscle straight for the mighty barrier. The palisade sagged and splintered to the impact, and through the breach rushed the infuriated bull. Korak heard the sounds that the others heard, and he interpreted them as the others did not. The flames were creeping closer to him when one of the blacks, hearing a noise behind him, turned to see the enormous bulk of Tantor lumbering toward them. The man screamed and fled, and then the bull-elephant was among them, tossing Negroes and Arabs to right and left as he tore through the flames he feared to the side of the comrade he loved. The sheikh, calling orders to his followers, ran to his tent to get his rifle. Tantor wrapped his trunk about the body of Korak and the stake to which it was bound, and tore it from the ground. The flames were searing his sensitive hide. Sensitive for all its thickness, so that in his frenzy to both rescue his friend and escape the hated fire, he had all but crushed the life from the ape-man. Lifting his burden high above his head, the giant beast wheeled and raced for the breach that he had just made in the palisade. The sheik, rifle in hand, rushed from his tent directly into the path of the maddened brute. He raised his weapon and fired once. The bullet missed its mark, and Tantor was upon him, crushing him beneath those gigantic feet as he raced over him as you and I might crush out the life of an ant that chanced to be in our pathway. And then, bearing his burden carefully, Tantor, the elephant, entered the blackness of the jungle.